Before I introduce tonight's speaker, who probably doesn't need an introduction, I just want to go over a couple of housekeeping. If for any reason we have an emergency, there's an exit to the vehicle room, as well as the entrance exit that you came in. The second thing I would like to ask everyone to do is to please silence your phones so that we don't have any dings or rings during our program. I want to thank all of those who donated on the way in. Our talks are free, but we do appreciate your donations. We are not affiliated with any municipal funding, or government funding, or the charitable funding. So we do depend and appreciate your donations. Tonight we have the honor of having Don Wilding back here with us. Don has been here many times and I never tire of hearing what he has to say. The other thing I just want to mention is that we do have some copies of two of the books that Don has written in the past, and they're on the table in the back. If anyone is interested in purchasing them again, I think Don would be persuaded to write something in them for you. And with that, I'll turn it over to Don.
Thanks, Eileen. And good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming. Always a pleasure to be back here at the Schoolhouse. Done many talks here, and I never get tired of it either. You know, when I got here tonight, as I often do if I have any time, I took a walk out along the salt pond, and I was just amazed at how calm and how quiet and what on a cloudy sky. You know, nice breeze, but not too much. Beautiful conditions. On Thanksgiving weekend of 1898, it was as much of the opposite as you could imagine from that. And let me get the technical stuff straight here before I move along.
Slideshow.
From beginning. There we go.
Yep.
So you've probably heard of the storm, the Portland Gale. And a lot of people say, why the Portland Gale? Why Portland? Well, not so much because of the city of Portland, but because of the steamer Portland, which was one of the biggest casualties of this storm. The Portland Gale happened over the weekend of November 26th and 27th of 1898. The storm didn't actually end until November 28th. And the Boston Sunday Post described it as a night to try men's souls. It was a night when the strongest of men trembled and when women wept. It was a night that should witness deeds of human bravery. It was a night of agony and of death. It was a night when the Coast Guardsman was remembered. This storm was so potent and so powerful that what it did with shipwrecks during this just one weekend, it really beefed up the statistics for the entire year. During the fiscal year of 1897, there were 394 disasters nationwide. During the Portland Gale storm, and this applies mostly to the mostly New England, there were 187 wrecks just in that storm. And this is some of the headlines that followed after a few days after the storm. Things were starting to come to light as to what had actually happened. You see all this all-day search for bodies from Portland and the graphic story of the awful disaster. 38 bodies washed ashore here on Cape Cod, many in this area, from Eastham all the way down to Chatham. And you notice some of these, the death toll kept going up from the Portland. It ended up being 192 people perished aboard the Portland. It's referred to as the Titanic of New England on many occasions. We also notice here on these headlines below where it says steamship dashed to pieces on the rocky shore of Cape Cod. Kind of tells me the editor has never been to Cape Cod. The Portland Gale was such a legendary storm. It was as powerful as the blizzard of '78, if you want to have some context for it. And you know how nowadays we all talk to people and say, well, back in my day, the blizzard of '78, well, it was that way with Portland Gale too for many years. And it was said there were many old timers left who were still willing and eager to settle down and begin their story. It was in '98 when the Portland went down. So there were 141 vessels wrecked in New England, 40 of them from Cape Cod. And that applied to along the Cape, but also Boston Harbor and many other spots along the New England coast. Vineyard Haven, 456 lives were lost total in this storm at sea. So that gives you an idea of how bad things got. And this was a typical thing. Maurice Richardson often talked about storms coming in. They were, you could see the conditions coming together. He would say, called it a weather breeder. And that's what happened here. Things looked kind of funny that day, that November 26th. A fellow named Alfred Nickerson of Chatham was rescued at sea during the storm in Boston Harbor. And he said at 2 p.m. that afternoon, he said, the ocean was smooth as glass, but the sky looked awfully funny. It had a shiny, glassy look, but when the storm started to blow, oh boy. A surfman named Ben Eldridge was down at Monomoy. He recalled that he was outside doing a bit of washing. And as he looked across the bay, there was this queer blue light over everything. Men were strangely quiet, not a joke among them. Oh, it's his fellow surfmen. And he said even the gulls were hanging around the flats. They weren't screaming at all. They were very quiet too. But the centerpiece of this whole story starts with the Portland, the steamer. This is how people got around in those days. If you wanted to travel, especially within New England, you either took the steamships up to Maine or wherever else they were going, or you took the railroad, one or the other. In this case, people were taking the Portland to Boston, from Boston to Portland. There was also another one that was coming at the same time, or was supposed to, from Portland to Boston, called the Bay State. And these two vessels went back and forth on a daily basis. And the Portland was named for the city in Maine. And it was about to leave Boston Harbor on the night of November 26th. This was a real state-of-the-art kind of vessel too. It was had celebrity status. Everybody in town knew about it. And it was, you could see inside of it, really fancy. And everybody, wanted to at least get a look at it. This is the route it ended up taking. It was supposed to go from Portland. We can't work on that screen. We'll have to I'll have to make do with my fingers. You can see where it leaves Boston at 7 p.m. that night. Its destination is Portland, but somehow during this storm at around 9 p.m., it curves out to sea and it ends up out over Massachusetts Bay at around 3 a.m. This is how bad the wind got. And nobody knows exactly what happened. There's a lot of theories. And then it drifted down. Originally, they thought it struck at Peak and Hill Bars off of Provincetown. Well, it didn't. It ended up sinking over Stowagon Neck in 460 feet of water. Wow. These were the weather maps for that weekend. And the weather forecasts weren't coming out as regularly as they are nowadays. But they were still on top of things as about as best they could be. And it was definitely predicting foul weather for the weekend, but not to the extent that it was going to be a bad situation. The captain of the Portland, a fellow named Hollis Blanchard. Blanchard had just been recently promoted to captain, and he was hearing about these warnings. He used to talk to the weather service pretty frequently, and it didn't stop him from his appointed run that night. They also they didn't want to cancel a passage if there was a chance to make one. Because they would lose the line's prestige, passenger fares to the competing railroad, and a delay in freight delivery. Both of the steamers were not only delivering people, they were delivering freight as well. They were carrying back and forth between the cities. And Blanchard was reportedly convinced that he could beat the storm to Portland because he had received the weather report prior to his departure, and it only included a storm moving in from Michigan. But they didn't really take into account what could happen because there was another storm brewing from the Gulf of Mexico that was coming up. This ended up being your classic Genesis type of situation. Blanchard used to visit the Weather Bureau office in Boston every day. He got to know the men there very, very well. And in fact, he had been called out by his superiors for being too careful. He didn't want to go on some certain occasions. They were saying, no, you're being too careful. But yet he was blamed for this in the media. He may have taken the chance, though, because of the pressure he may have been getting from his superiors. So this storm ended up being a lot more than what people thought was coming. It was a hurricane-force storm. And what happened up at Highland Light, every window pane on the ocean side of the house, the signal station at Highland Light, was blown in and smashed into 1,000 fragments. Men exposed to the full force of the storm were blown from their feet and hurled around like blocks of wood. That's how Isaac Small, was the keeper at Highland Light, described the effect of this storm. He also recorded a wind gust of 90 miles an hour during the height of the storm. Actually, there were other people who recorded wind gusts of over 100. Joshua James, he's shown down there on the right-hand corner. He's the only one in the dark outfit. He is one of the great lifesavers of all time. He was the keeper of the Point Allerton station in Hogg. He estimated that the visibility at sea was only 100 yards at best. So if you're out there trying to maneuver your way through these waves, which are incredibly high, and you can only see 100 yards in front of you, you're in trouble. So, and within 2 hours of this storm beginning at around 7 o'clock, 200 vessels from Casco Bay to Martha's Vineyard were scrambling for safe harbor from the storm. So Portland, as it's making its way out of Boston Harbor and heading up north along the North Shore, there were 4 quartermasters. They were manning a 6-foot steering wheel. And nobody knows exactly what happened. Whether there's some reports they may have lost their lights and the storm was starting to batter the ship apart already. And they were not able to take shelter around Newburyport and Gloucester, probably because if Blanchard had tried to do so, he would have run the vessel aground, and that would have been an instant disaster. So there was a lot of things that they thought he might be trying to do, like, for instance, turning out to sea and riding out the storm, or heading for Provincetown Harbor, trying to get in there. The winds, though, and they switched to the northwest later on, kind of just blew him out to sea. And he was, and again, nobody knows exactly what happened, but by Sunday morning, there were reports of the Portland having been possibly spotted off of Cape Cod. And even the people on Cape Cod knew about the Portland, what it was, and they were probably saying to themselves, what is that doing out here? It should be, up around Boston or around Portland, Maine. On daybreak, Sunday morning, the 27th, Captain Sam Fisher was the keeper of the Race Point Life-Saving Station. He claimed to have heard from close offshore bells and whistle blasts, believed to be the Portlands, because he thought it was a steamer. And he couldn't really see the ship, though, because of the snowstorms and the sea spray. Even though there was a break in the storm, there was an eye that had formed in the storm, and there was a few moments of calm there. That is when he was believed to have heard these sounds from the steamer. There was another steamer out there too, a cargo ship called the Pentagon. It was a former revenue cutter and Civil War gunboat that was now a freighter carrying, in this case, Christmas toys to Maine. And they were out around High Head in Truro, not too far away from where the Portland was, before they both kind of vanished from sight. There was a fishing boat too called the Ruth M. Martin that its captain Michael Hogan. They were in trouble and they were trying to get to port. And while they were struggling around out in the ocean, Hogan claims to have seen the Portland in distress. Also, not knowing exactly, he thought it might be Portland, but no, later on, maybe it was the Pentagon, he wasn't sure. There was also a ship called it was a schooner called the Mary A. Tyler. It was captained by a fellow named Alan Bragg, who ended up at Brewster, and I'll tell you his story a little later. But he was heading from Maine to New York, carrying a load of paper. And Bragg later told his daughter, Mary, many years later, that night he passed so close to the Portland out in Massachusetts Bay that he could have touched it, but he couldn't help it all. There was no way. He was just trying to keep his own ship going because they were being tossed around by these huge waves. And this is probably something what it looked like inside the Portland while all this was going on, when the when it started taking on water. So at 7:30 Sunday night, a surfman named John Johnson from the Race Point Station recovers a light observer, and it says on it, STR Portland, while he was out on patrol. And within the next few hours, a lot more debris from the Portland started washing ashore with the rising tide. And it wasn't just preservers and things like that. It was supplies, it was they found caskets washing ashore that the ship was carrying. There were tubs of lard, you name it. There was all kinds of things that were coming ashore. And then bodies. The first one was found at 2:20 a.m. on the morning of November 28th. Gideon Bowley of the High Head Life Saving Station in Truro found the body on the beach. And not too long after that, Cahoon Hollow, George Graham, he was one of the Portland's crew members. He was recovered, his body was recovered. And over the next few hours, many more started to wash up on the bodies of Cape Cod. The way the currents worked from where the Portland went down actually took a lot of the bodies down to this area, to Eastham, and particularly Orleans and Chatham, down towards that direction. And Alice Law, who wrote the book Nauset on Cape Cod, especially many of you here at the Eastham Historical Society are familiar with this book. She talked about it. She said many bodies and pieces of wreckage came ashore at Nauset, and tales are still being told of the carting of bodies to the railroad station and of distressed relatives waiting anxiously in the Cape towns for their loved ones to be released from the angry seas. The outlines of other vessels had been glimpsed offshore during the storm and were known to have been lost, their wreckage also littering the beach with each return of the tide. Dr. Maurice Richardson of Wellfleet, also of Newton, and you might know the Richardson name around here, also Ryan Richardson, House on Lost Marsh, Elliot Richardson later on. Maurice Richardson, at the time, had a summer home in Wellfleet. And he saw two bodies washed ashore in Wellfleet, on the outer beach of Wellfleet. Both had life preservers from the Portland on it. He said one was probably a deckhand and a man of about 20. The other body was that of a stout woman, he said. And he found other things too, like some piano keys and furniture upholstered in red plush and cases of lard directed to Portland. And when the bodies started washing ashore, they noticed a lot of these people had watches. And they were all stopped in the area of 9:15, 9:17, some as late as 10 o'clock. So that's about the time we figure that the ship went down. And obviously the watches stopped working. I found this list downstairs here in the archives, a list of bodies from the Portland of people that washed ashore in Eastham. And this lists 8 people that washed ashore in Eastham, most of them from Maine, some from England or Canada. But these were 8 of the 38 bodies that washed ashore along Cape Cod, 30 miles of beach. About 7 years ago, I wrote a story about this for the Cape Cod newspaper, and I got an email from Rick Lindholm, and he said to me, you know, my great-grandmother talked about the Portland when I was young, and she told me about the bodies they found on the beach in Eastham, and that the funeral home on Bridge Road in South Eastham was full and the ground was frozen, so they kept a lot of bodies in the barn behind her. He referred to her, his uncle's house, which was right near the funeral home. They couldn't bury any of the bodies because the ground was frozen and covered with snow. So that made things even more difficult. This I also found downstairs. This was Al Snow from Orleans actually wrote this later on for the Cape Codder as well, but he typed it up for the Eastham Historical Society in 1969. And he talked about how one of the, he said actually a lad of 13 told the story. That was Captain Edwin Horton. Edwin Horton Sr. related the amazing word that one of the Portland's quartermasters, a giant of a man known as a powerful athlete and swimmer, made Eastham's beach alive, but exhausted. This I find hard to believe, but you never know. But the conditions were just too extreme, and the ship was too far out for anybody to have survived this. And he went over to the body. He thought the man was dead, and he turned him over. And according to the story here, that was the surfman found this man, and he looked up and said, "For God's sake, don't leave me," because the surfman was going to go run and get help. Well, that's exactly what he did, and he came back and the guy was dead. That's how the story goes. So it's not a story that can be really verified. So nobody actually did survive the sinking of the Portland. And the debris that washed ashore, some of it that washed ashore, this picture is also downstairs here. Rufus Snow, Captain Rufus Snow of Orleans, was a weekender at Sand City, colony of cottages in Orleans near Nauset Beach. He found the Portland's big 6-foot double steering wheel with 200 feet of line attached to it. And he started taking this wheel around New England. He exhibited the wheel in Boston, also in Maine. And when he got up there, that's when it was seized by the Portland Steamship Company. They had a cease and desist order. And they had it destroyed because it hurt their business, bad publicity. In March of 1899, for about 4 months later, there was a fishing schooner called the Maud S. And the Maud S had actually spotted the Portland off the North Shore on November 26th, the night it was still heading up north towards Portland. And the Maud S crew, while they were pulling their nets up and everything over Stellwagen Bank, pulled up parts of wreckages, pieces of wreckage by their trolls near Stellwagen Bank. And the Boston Globe said the frame of the berth picked up by the Maud S came from the ladies' cabin. And from what he says about the cross pieces, I have no doubt it belonged to the Portland. The electric fixtures also were identified by Stewart Harris of the Bay State, which was the sister steamer of the Portland. So they as early as 1899, they were finding pieces of the Portland out over Stellwagen Bank. Edward Ross Snow is probably most well known for being connected to the search for the Portland. Snow was very active in this. He had actually put together a party, some sailing vessels to actually go look for it. They claimed to have found it at one point. It proved not to be Portland. And Snow also put together an organization of the called the Portland Associates, the relatives of the victims, that would come out to the Cape every year on the anniversary of the storm. And this plaque was arranged by Edward Ross Snow. It's up at Highland Light now. So if you ever go out to Highland Light in Truro, you can actually see that plaque. Snow wrote extensively about the Portland, but I do give him some mention, but I tried to not go into too much what Snow had already written about it. They did finally find, though, the Portland. It was finally located, first in 1989. It was discovered in 460 feet of water, Stellwagen Bank National Marine Sanctuary, by the Bourne-based Historical Maritime Group of New England. That's led by John P. Fish and H. Arnold Carr. And they located it, but they couldn't get that, they didn't have the capacity to really get down there and photograph it. Well, finally, NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the Stellwagen Bank National Marine Sanctuary, and Klein Sonar Associates of New Hampshire managed to get down there and took images of the sunken Portland in 2002. And this is just one of the images of it. So it shows it almost intact. But what happened again, nobody knows. They can't get down there either because you can't go on there because it is a marine sanctuary. So the government says you can't go, you can't touch it. And plus the depth is way too dangerous for divers to get down to. I mean, the Antarctica is only in 200 feet of water in Nantucket Sound. So that gives you an idea how far down Portland is. So the Portland, that was enough already. That was tragic enough. But all across the Cape, there were shipwrecks happening, ships running ashore, getting stuck. The harbors in both Provincetown and Martha's Vineyard, Vineyard Haven, were just, the vessels were being tossed around like toys, is how the papers described it. Provincetown was one of them. There was, both harbors had about 3 dozen or so vessels that were just being thrown around by the storm and by the waves. Up in Provincetown, at the Wood End Station, Isaac Fisher was the keeper at the time, and he and his crew were alerted about ships being in trouble in the harbor. This is at Wood End now. It took them 10 hours to reach these 2 vessels, the Lester A. Lewis and the Jordan Mott, that were in trouble in the harbor. 10 hours just from Wood End. Many of you have probably gone out to the West End there, and by the Provincetown Inn, you can walk across the breakwater, and you're at Wood End Lighthouse in no time, within maybe a half an hour, and then you can even walk out to Long Point. Just because of the conditions, the ocean breaking through the beach there, and what they had to endure, it took them 10 hours to get them and their boat out to these 2 boats that were stranded in the harbor. 5-man crews on each boat, Lester A. Lewis of Bangor and the 2-masted coaster Jordan L. Mott of Rockland. They stayed aboard the ships, but by Sunday night, 6 of the 10 men were frozen to death. The gale began in the early evening. Snow increased by to 11 p.m. It was really bad. By Sunday morning, the boats were piling up in the West End, and this is before the breakwater was built. The breakwater wasn't built until about 1911, I think it was. And so boats were piling up in the West End. This is where the Mayflower was docked. And now these boats were piling up during this storm. And the surf was coming up to the back of the Wood End Station at that point. And the Mott was sunk to its upper works. The captain and the ship's cabin boy, they were nearly dead. The companions had been beating on them, literally beating on them to keep them from freezing. It's the only thing they could do. The father of the captain, he was the steward of the ship, he was already dead. His body frozen solid, encrusted with snow up in the masts, because they would lash themselves to the masts. This is something that a lot of shipwreck victims would do. You know, if they were stuck, they would climb up in the masts and tie themselves there and hope they got rescued. And they did manage to, the lifesavers did manage to remove 4 survivors from that ship, which was pretty amazing in itself. The Lester Lewis was close by. Only its deck house and masts were above water. 4 men in the rigging showed no signs of life. Another lay frozen in the cabin, and which had no roof at this point. And the captain said he thought that the Lewis crew had given up. The mod captain said that the Lewis crew had given up early and had died before the lifesavers even got there. So this was the scene a few days later after the tides had subsided, and there was a woman. She was described. Her name was only given as Mrs. Henry Spears. They never gave the ladies' names in full back in those days. And she watched from her windows while men cut those frozen bodies out of the rigging from the Jordan mud. And from that time on, she kept the shades drawn on every window that faced the harbor. So that's what, you know, she was so horrifying to her. And out on the back shore, things weren't much better. There was another wreck going on. The schooner Albert L. Butler came ashore along what they call Picket Hill Bars, probably the most treacherous area off of Provincetown. This ship was carrying logwood from Jamaica to Boston, and the storm just drove it ashore Sunday morning. And the lifesavers got the call. They from somebody who was on patrol, one of their surfmen. And by the time the surf boat and the apparatus were able to get there, ship was about 50 yards away. And so they used the Lyle gun to use the breeches buoy, which was basically the zip line between shore and ship. They fired a shot. One man grabbed it, but he didn't wait for the necessary parts to create the zip line. And he ended up being dragged through the surf. You know, ice cold in December, raging surf, but he survived it. And 2 more tried to come ashore the same way. That's how they thought they were supposed to do it. And they got hit by a 20-foot wave, and that was the end of them. So those 2 men died. And then later on, after they had finished the rescue, or so they thought, the tide subsided, and 2 men came out of the cabin. They had been hiding there the whole time. And one of them came out, and he had this big parrot on his shoulder. And the surfman described the parrot as having quite the salty language. And but they said the bird was right about one thing. He said that storm was a real humdinger, is what the bird said. The press descended upon the Cape very quickly, any way they could get out there. And it was described that the surfmen, the lifesaving service, they worked like fiends, was how the Portland Daily Press described the efforts in Provincetown. The sand cut their faces until they were raw and bleeding. That's how bad, when you got 100-mile-an-hour winds blowing that sand is brutal when it starts hitting you. I mean, I've walked the beach during windy days, and, you know, sand's hitting your bare legs, that hurts. When it's hitting your face during a driving storm, it's nasty. And yes, it does lead to bleeding faces. One of them, during that storm, one of the Provincetown rescuers had to thwart a wind that swept sharp fine sand through the air in smothering streaks that cut like the strokes of a whiplash, was how the life-saving service report put it. And this was very trying on the surfman. The job's stressful enough, but during this weekend, with all these bodies washing ashore, they were exhausted by trying to recover their beats out there. And several of them were completely unnerved by the frequent trying experiences, dragging torn and sea-washed bodies from the surf. They were made almost nervous wrecks by the constant nightly contact and disfigured, and these unfortunate victims that were thrown up onto the beach. A lot of times too, after a few days of this, the bodies were starting, headless or missing body parts after a while. And they would also, a lot of them would be weighed down because bodies, when they're in the ocean, they start to get weighed down by sand. If they're wearing any clothes, the sand gets caught up in the clothes and it just drags them down. So that's why some of these bodies never washed ashore. And then a lot of them probably went down with the ship as well, with the Portland. And Ben Eldridge described it. He said it was a terrible week that we spent. Sometimes we could just see a hand sticking up in the sand. And when we done, of course, we exposed the body. And it was the lifesavers' duties to transport these bodies to the proper authorities, to the undertakers for burial. And in response to a journalist's question, a surfman from the Beacon Hill Bars station in Provincetown told of the gruesome details of finds he had made in the method of carrying the dead to the station. And the reporter asked him if it wasn't rather hard on the nerves. His answer was, "We can't think about that. They're someone's friends." That's how they had to look at it. And the Boston Sunday Post made this comment a week after the storm. They said, "Nigh 300 souls were lost on that awful night, but you did your best. You are the heroes of the blizzard. Some of you toiled all night alone. Some of you walked up and down the wreck-strewn beaches. Some manned the boats. Some secured the saved at the station houses. All are heroes." And it wasn't just the lifesaving service. They were so overworked that volunteers came forward in many towns. One of them was in Provincetown. It was a fellow named Captain Robert Lavender. Lavender was a retired captain and he and a group of other seafaring veterans from Provincetown all went out and tried to and successfully rescued a man that was stuck up in the masts in Provincetown Harbor. His name was William Forrest. And all these men were awarded the Congressional Medal for Bravery after they rescued Forrest from the schooner F.H. Smith during the storm. Lavender went around town, had a crowd of people around him. And he said, "Men, we know that there is one of us out there on the rigging. It's a life, mates, and I'm going to try to get at him. I call for volunteers." Lavender and 10 men found an old leaky boat at a local boatyard. And they took it out into the bay with a bunch of people watching from the shore too in the middle of this storm. And Lavender ended up getting knocked out of the boat very quickly by a huge wave. And he's shaking his head and he's in the water. He says, "Don't mind me, boys." He says, "Keep it going and I'll make sure, all right." And they said, "Like the devil you will." And they pulled him back on board, and people on the beach are cheering, and the masts are about to topple this schooner, the guy on it. And they got to the boat and they said, "All right, matey, you swing clear of the shrouds and gear and let go. We'll take care of you." And the guy dropped into the ocean and they quickly pulled him out into the rescue boat and pulled him to safety. Reporters, journalists were out here in full force. No, not the TV cameras, but the newspaper reporters certainly were. One of them was a fellow named Charles Ward. He was a reporter. He was the Cape correspondent for the Boston Herald. And he lived in Chatham at the time. And he would go around the Cape, pick up all these little news items and everything usually. And in his travels after the storm, as the storm finished, he had received a portion of a telegraph message from Highland Line to Hyannis. Because the lines, the phone lines were down on the Cape, all around. So I couldn't get any kind of information. Any information they did get was pretty scarce. Ward had got this piece of a telegraph message saying that the Portland had been wrecked off of Cape Cod. And so he grabs it, he gets all the story information that he needs to, And to get to Boston, he can't call it in. So he has to go to Boston. And a lot of the train tracks are wiped out. The lines are down. So in the storm, he manages somehow to he gets a train from Hyannis. It was a special train that the authorities had put together. And he got to East Sandwich, and the tracks were blocked by snow and also floodwaters. High tides had come in. Ward then borrowed a horse from a Sandwich farmer that he somehow got to in downtown Sandwich. Rides into Buzzards Bay, then he catches another train to Boston, gets up to the Herald office, delivers the news there, and he even hears people in the newsroom talking about how Portland was safe in Provincetown Harbor. And he was keeping quiet until he could get all the news right to his editor. He finally gets his editor, tells him the news, passes out. The editor's hanging over him, trying to revive him with whiskey. And he finally is able to put together the rest of the story for the editor. And the Herald had the exclusive on this story. A few days later, they're trying to get names of victims because the only manifest for Portland went down with the ship. They never left anything behind. So it became standard procedure after that to leave the manifest behind, a copy of the manifest behind, a list of the passengers. And Frank Stanion had been sent down here to the Cape by the Boston Globe. And because there was another storm a few days later, took the lines down again. And Stanion had gotten a list of names of victims after hustling around and getting some names. And he got the story, and he was trying to get his story in from Orleans, and he used a rather unusual relay system to do it. There were a lot of reporters. The Shattuck House in Orleans was being used as sort of a headquarters for the press, and so the Shattuck House had all these reporters hanging around. And this particular night, they had all adjourned for dinner and drinks, and Stanion thought about how he would get his list of victims to the Globe, and he's heading out in the snow. And he found himself near a building where he could hear the click of a telegraph key. You probably all know where this is going. Yeah. In he went and found out that, yes, it was a telegraph station. Not a regular business, but it was the French cable station in Orleans. And at the cable station in Orleans, they had been doing very little business because of the failure of the telegraph line into New York. That was down. So the superintendent, his name was Hugh Osborne, the guy sitting, the tall gentleman sitting down there with the hat on his lap in the center. He was the superintendent of the French cable station. And he was an Englishman in charge of the French cable station. And he welcomes Stanion in and agrees to help him out. And in a matter of seconds, the message speeds from Orleans, where the French cable station was, and now museum still is, from Cape Cod to St. Pierre and Miquelon, these islands off of Newfoundland and Canada, which are actually French colonies. Then under the Atlantic Ocean by cable to Brest, France. Then from France to London, and from London via British Postal Service to Ireland, then roughly 2,500 miles to Nova Scotia, and down the storm-swept coast of New England into Boston. So Stanion, newspaper reporters, and I was in the business for 3 decades. Yes, you do whatever you can to get a story, and that's impressive. And 2 towboats had arrived from Boston, filled with newspaper men, and Provincetown seemed full of them all at once. This is right after, not too long after the storm ended. And they were interviewing anyone who had anything to say, trying to get together some kind of a story on the disaster. The only two hotels in the place were crowded to the very doors. And a lot of these reporters would hire horse and carriage teams for transportation to get around, because it's tough enough to get around Provincetown now. Imagine what it was like back then. And they wanted to go out to the life-saving stations in Provincetown and Truro to find out what had happened with a lot of these wrecks. And just even in town, there were some pretty horrid stories. The Portland Daily Press had these two accounts. They said the unidentified body of a woman thought to be about 50 was one of the many at the undertaking room in Provincetown. She had a, quote, cruel cut on her head, evidently caused by contact with a piece of wreckage while in the water after the steamer broke up. And he said, and the reporter also wrote, these tales were sickening and painful to listen to. We could not but shudder at terrific tales of this horrible storm. And a lot of relatives of those that were on the Portland were arriving on the Cape by train. That's the only way to get out, searching for their kin. This is after they finally put some of the tracks back together. And they had to do that very quickly. Some of them were searching, some of these people were out here searching for days, going to different towns, just trying to find some kind of a clue. And some of them didn't find their relatives at all. The railroad tracks were washed out in both Truro and in Sandwich, and it closed off the train service for several days after the storm. That little sketch you see over there was up in Provincetown. It was washed out in Truro. They took out the tracks. They actually had to go over the dunes with these carriages, carrying people from one train to another. That's how it had to work. This is the scene from Sandwich. And this was an area of another washout. They had a lot of pictures in the Sandwich Town archives, which is where I found some of these. Town Neck between Sandwich and Sagamore was 3 to 4 miles of tracks were washed out, as well as 300 feet of track at the Brickyard in West Barnstable. It was reported that a tidal wave, that's what they called it, crossed the railroad track and covered parts of Main Street in Sandwich with 3 to 4 feet of water. They also reported a tidal wave in Wellfleet Harbor. That's how bad the tide was. These are some pretty impressive photos too. This one on the left, I am told, according to the Sandwich Town archives, is the Dan Webster Inn. And you can see some of these big trees that were Sandwich was famous for were all down. Churches were damaged, houses unroofed, chimneys thrown down, several barns and small buildings were demolished, streets were impassable, and that was because of these trees, elms and silver oaks, the pride of the town. Loss of livestock was heavy. Many houses were surrounded by water, some were flooded. One family was rescued in a boat. Main Street was covered, 3 to 4 feet of water. And in Provincetown, this is just a couple of the pictures I got from the Pilgrim Monument and Provincetown Museum. It was reported that the wharfs, except for one, were ruined. This pretty much wiped out any fishing industry and whaling industry that was left in Provincetown. Not too long after this, you started seeing the artist colonies popping up. Instead of, the artists kind of took over the town after this. There wasn't as much going on in the way of fishing and whaling. Central Wharf was in the town's West End. There was a building that had 155 barrels of flour, and that was flooded. Imagine what that looked like. Union Wharf was a big business center that was demolished, and its packing shed scattered several miles. And out at Long Point, the very tip of Provincetown, the lightkeepers were being surrounded by the high tides coming in. And the whole end of the point was flooded, the lightkeeper told the Boston Globe. It looked like as if we would be swept away. And they were responsible for keeping the fog bell operational, which meant venturing outside to wind it. And the lightkeeper was already sick, so that made things tough. They managed to accomplish this, but as he returned to the house, the tide kept rising 4 feet deep all around the house, he said. And the lighthouse had a water tank too, and it weighed a ton when it was full. and it was lifted up by the tide and carried out into the bay. A lot of Cape Cod mariners were lost at sea too. And this one out of the archives of the Dennis Historical Society's Maritime Museum in West Dennis. On the night of November 22nd, a few days before the storm hit, Captain John Garfield, he was from West Dennis, and another captain, Mark Holmes of New Haven. They were out dining together in Philadelphia. They were, over the years, they've become very good friends through their sailing circles. They got to know each other pretty well. And both were about to embark on yet another coal run. That's what these guys did with their vessels. 96 hours later, these two mariners were together once again, only in a manner that they did not expect. Both were lashed to the masts of their respective ships, dead at the bottom of the ocean off Montauk Point. Garfield was only 36 years old. He was the captain of the three-masted schooner James B. Pace, member of the prestigious Boston Marine Society. And Holmes was captain of the Howard M. Hanscom. And November 24th, they both left. They were loaded with coal. Garfield and the Pace were going to Boston. Holmes and the Hanscom were headed for Providence. They typically would sail together next to each other. And after the storm, nobody knew what happened to them. The fate was a mystery. The edition, the next month's edition of the New York Maritime Register reported the Pace was overdue and followed by several months of missing status. Garfield had a wife and 2 children, and 5 sisters, 2 brothers. Danny Nickerson was the first mate. He was a young guy. His wife was taking care of an 8-month-old son in Dennisport. And the days and weeks passed. So you can imagine what these families were going through. And any optimism for the Pace's survival was starting to fade fast. And it was over a year later, December of 1899, government divers were, quote, investigating navigational obstructions at the bottom of the seas off Montauk Point. They discovered the Pace and the Hanscom. And the New York Maritime Register relayed the details, saying, in both vessels, the divers report that skeletons of men were found lashed to the rigging or to the rails of the vessels. And while there's nothing left of the flesh, it's thought they can be recognized by the clothing. Captain Alan Bragg, no, he did not perish in the storm, but this is his headstone. He's buried in Brewster. He died in 1956, November 28th, 58 years to the day after the storm ended, oddly enough. By some folks' rules, one is only a true Cape Codder when the family archives trace back to the Mayflower, or thereabouts. But Alan Bragg became a genuine Cape Codder in an initiation that few, if any, Brewster-born folks had undergone. And he lived to tell a tale. He was captain of the Mary A. Tyler, and they were carrying a load of paper from Maine to New York. I mentioned him earlier in the program about being close to Portland. And this vessel off Cape Cod broke in two, and it ended up stranding near Paynes Creek in Brewster. And Bragg was a North Carolina native. And in fact, he was a relative of descendant of Fort Bragg, from that family. His crew ended up having to get up in the rigging, and when the tide ebbed, they were fortunately rescued by a Brewster captain, Jeremiah Wakeson, and several other men. And this is the description that was given to the Brewster Historical Society by his daughter back in 1971. It was described that grimly, he and his men worked to keep their own ship afloat. Just before night fell, as the terrifically high and pounding waters off Cape Cod, his boat broke in two. The forecastle remained just enough above water to allow the men to try, but in vain, light a blaze, however small, for warmth by pouring kerosene on coal. They had a few water-soaked soda crackers, but they were too frozen and sick to eat. They tied themselves together with a rope, and after hours of struggling with the wind and icy deck, managed to lash themselves to the mast. All during that frozen night of horror, the wind whipped the mast into the sea, tossing it up and down as though it was more than a splinter, freezing them to it. Their clothes were ice to their bodies. They were vomiting, nearly unconscious. The wind abated somewhat toward morning, and after daybreak, they were sighted from shore. And that's when they were rescued by Captain Wicks and brought to his home and several other homes in Brewster right nearby. Bragg also told his daughter that for a long, long time, the tides brought in rolls of paper from his wrecked ship, which the natives gathered, dried, and used. I read that the school newspaper in Brewster was produced from this paper for many, many years. And oddly enough, a few years later, Bragg married Wickson's daughter in 1904. He kept coming back to Brewster after this. And he stayed there, had a very long life, was involved in both the First and Second World War. During World War I, he was the lieutenant commander for the US Navy, leading some of the largest transports of the war. And in World War II, he worked for the government as a civilian in charge of a Michigan shipyard, which built small boats. And his memory still lives on. If you go to the Captain's Golf Course in Brewster, they're all named, all the holes are named after ship captains. Michael Pregat, who was here recently, was providing me with some of the information about those captains. He was the one who dug up a lot of the captain's information for the golf course. Where the second hole on the starboard course is named for Alan Bragg. So if you ever go golfing over there, you can remember that. Benjamin Hogg was a Hyannis native, called him Gentleman Ben. He somehow led the steel tug Eureka into Boston Harbor through the storm, with 3 coal barges in tow. And according to Earl Rich, the Wellfleet historian, he had command of the 10 men on the Eureka, as well as 9 men on the crews of the 3 coal barges. And he came out of this with no loss of life. He was halfway between, during the storm, went ahead, between Pollock Rip Lightship off Chatham and Truro. He was working for a company in Providence, traveling from South Amboy, New Jersey to Boston. And 2 of the barges came ashore on Gallows Island in Boston Harbor. And he couldn't even see enough to identify the barges. And he didn't even know where they had gone ashore at that point. But, and the Eureka lost a part of its wheel too by striking some hidden obstruction. But everybody came out of it okay. And Rich asked him later on why he didn't turn back earlier on, because, and Rich gave, Hawes gave a very carefully worded answer. He said, "There's a lot you don't know yet, boy, about towing a string of barges. You have others to think of. I did think of trying to make Nauset Inlet at one point, but gave up the idea knowing my tail barge would never make it. I would rather have gone down with them than to have been the only survivor." So that's not always the case too, because I've seen a lot of accounts from the tugboats where they just cut the barges off. With men on board the barges. One of the heroes of the entire rescue operation out here was the medical examiner, Dr. Samuel Davis. He was based in Orleans. And he was the medical examiner that kind of headed up everything during the Portland Gale afterwards. Referred to as a untiring official. And he was on top of just about everybody that came up from the sea. He was originally from Martha's Vineyard. Spent 30 years in Orleans before he moved back to the vineyard for the last 10 years of his life. And for those, there were mobs of people coming down here looking for bodies, for loved ones. And Davis made a request for that. He said, with a full description, he said, give me photographs, full description as to age, color of hair, eyes, whether the person wore a beard or a mustache, if so, what shade, marks upon the body, jewelry of any kind, clothing, its description, a full, complete description to all photographs, and these must be attached to the picture in some way, so he could figure out who was who, they could make identifications. Letters have been pouring into him since Tuesday after the storm, at the rate of nearly 100 a day, and their requests for information tell of the tremendous sorrow the entire New England states are weighed down under during this whole thing. And he urged that they move all the bodies to Boston as soon as possible. And these were all put on the train. And these were assisted by the undertakers, the state police, and created quite a hectic scene at the Orleans train station too. And as I mentioned earlier, he had Davis and his wife left Orleans 1909, moved back to the vineyard. And he had quite the presence here in this area, though, for many years. And one of the bodies, this is winding it down here, this is one of the bodies that was found close to, well, after the disaster, was spotted by a young man. Helen Freeman Stevens wrote this in the Cape Cod in 1946. She said the young man was identified only as Clarence. And she referred to him as a boy. I dug a little further, found out Clarence was not a boy, he was about 20 years old. But again, they were considered minors in those days. And Clarence Rogers was his name, from Orleans. He was out walking along Nauset Beach in Orleans a few days after the storm, relatively calm, mild day. And he spotted the body of a young lady, about his age, wearing only a white nightgown and a black stocking. And he was stunned. So he covered up her body with his coat, and then he ran back to town. That's a long run. But he headed back to town for the local undertaker's office. And quickly they got the cart out, and Clarence tagged along. He developed quite a fascination with this whole thing. And it was noted by Stevens that for some strange reason, perhaps because the victim was so near his own age, perhaps because the discovery had been his, the happening held for him a horrible fascination. And back at the undertaker's office, the local officials were trying to figure out who she was. The casket was chosen by Clarence. And he said, well, if that's the way, they said, well, if that's the way youth sees it, why not? That was their reasoning before accepting it, because they hadn't been able to identify any family members, or finally relatives from Maine got to Orleans and claimed the body. And they weren't too fond of the choice that Clarence had made for the casket, and they chose another one. And so this one was sitting there all winter. Throughout the winter, Clarence stopped by the office on occasion to regretfully view the casket. And later that winter, Clarence got sick, he developed a cold, and that grew into pneumonia. And it wasn't long before Clarence died. And following his death, they had to choose the casket. And they all agreed that the casket he had selected for the girl was the most appropriate one in which to bury him. And they had the funeral gathering at the cemetery in Orleans. And the paper, the Yard Register noted this, every day at a certain time, the family dog can be seen going up to the tomb. And there he lies down beside the door, waiting for his master, who cometh not out to his faithful friend. What a beautiful sight it is. And this also prompted the writing of a poem, which turned into a song, The Loss of Steamer Portland. How far it got as a song, I don't know. I'm sure Casey Kasem was playing it, but which was written by Captain Frederick R. Eldridge and hydrographer George Eldridge of Chatham, a relation. 326-word poem opened with the lines, "On the 27th of November in the year of 98, a northeast blizzard swept the sea, death following in its wake." And that some of the song, which it had grown into, made a very big impact on a visitor from New York. His name was E.W. Blanchard. He was the brother of Alice Blanchard, Portland's captain. And he was staying at the Monterey Inn. And Blanchard was driving around town with George Eldridge. And Eldridge sang to him the song of the Portland, and according to the Chatham Monitor, affected him very much. You can only imagine. There was also a composition written many years later in 1938 by actually right after the storm, but it was published in 1938. Annie Newcomb Spalding of Greenwood, Mass. Well, she was a kid in Provincetown during the storm. And she wrote this very informative composition for her class when she was 15, English class, right after the storm. And it was published in the Provincetown Advocate in 1938. And one line pretty much described everything well. "A terrible event which rested so heavily on the hearts of many and which will not soon depart." And coming in the spring of 2023 is my next book, my fourth book, Cape Cod and the Portland Gale of 1898. There's many books that have been written on the Portland Gale. A lot of them do focus a lot on the disaster of the steamer. I do focus on that, but I also tell a lot of these stories that I told here and many more as well. So that will be out, I'm told, sometime next spring. And my upcoming events, I'll be talking about Shipwrecks of Cape Cod, which is my most recent book, down the street on Sunday morning at 10 a.m. Chapel of the Pines, for the Nelson Fellowship of Universalist Unitarian. And July 20th, I'll be doing a rum running on Cape Cod program at the Sandwich Library. July 26th, Shipwrecks of Cape Cod comes to Sturgis Library in Barnstable. Off Cape Cod Lore in Mansfield, August 2nd. I'll be signing books at the Falmouth Art Market, August 18th. August 24th, the Portland Gale program. This one will be for the Bourne Historical Society. I will probably focus more on the disasters up there, Sandwich and Martha's Vineyard for that program. And August 25th, Henry Beston's Cape Cod, subject to my first book, which will be at the Centers for History and Culture in Orleans. You might also know it as the Orleans Historical Society. dwcapecod.com is my website. You can get business cards in the back. I'll be at the table. Also have postcards with information about the Portland Gale book, which you're free to take. And yeah, there are books. I guess we have a couple of copies of Brief History of Eastham. And also I have copies of Shipwrecks of Cape Cod, which is my most recent book, published in May of 2021. Does anybody have any questions before we adjourn? Okay, all right, well, thank you.
Very good.
Just escape it.